The Green Dragon, China's Modern Environmental Revolution. Introduction. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping began a period of reform and increased openness in China after decades of harsh communist rule under the leadership of Mao Zedong. During that time, the country's main emphasis had been on redeeming its cultural and national identity that had been lost after the national humiliation at the hands of foreign imperialists. The communist leadership after 1949 set out to revive the Chinese nation by rallying the masses with huge yet disastrous programs like the Great Leap Forward and later the Cultural Revolution. At that time, China did not seem to possess much of an environmental movement. The country's top priority was rejuvenation and glory. After the Mao years, China decided it was time to improve its economy and open itself up to the rest of the world. The decision proved successful, and the country's economy grew at an incredible speed. What followed, however, was an unprecedented use of energy and environmental degradation. By 2007, China had become the world's #1 emitter of carbon dioxide. With a population of nearly 1.4 billion, China is now both the world's leading consumer of energy as well as the world's largest emitter of carbon pollution. The degradation of China's environment has unfortunately existed longer than we might think. Robert Mark's China, Its Environment and History chronicles, for example, the construction of over 20,000 miles of roads under the Qin and Han dynasties, the dramatic change in the course of the Yellow River, engineered in 1194, and the origins of the highly fertile Pearl River Delta, which, far from being a natural formation, arose through a buildup of sediment deliberately abetted to farmers to increase the acreage of cultivatable land. In 2014, only 8 Chinese cities had met the country's air quality standards. Despite these depressing statistics, however, it was an obvious improvement from the year before when only 3 cities had made that grade. China's most polluted cities are located within the industrial province of Hebei, where the average reading of PM 2.5, also known as tiny particles that can embed themselves deep in the lungs, were 93 micrograms per cubic meter, almost triple the country's national standard of 35. There is no doubt that China is facing enormous environmental problems. According to the World Bank, 16 of the 20 most polluted cities are in China. According to the Chinese government sources, about a fifth of urban cities have heavily polluted air. The air pollution and smog in Beijing and Shanghai are sometimes so bad that the airports are shut down because of poor visibility. The air quality in Beijing is 16 times worse than that of New York City. According to a World Bank study, only 1% of China's 560 million city dwellers breathe air considered safe by European Union standards. In 2010, Edward Wong wrote in the New York Times that outdoor air pollution had contributed to 1.2 million premature deaths in China. That is nearly 40% of the global total. 1/3 of China's mainland is regularly soaked in acid rain, and half of the cities in the country and all around receive at least some sort of acid rain. In some places, every rainy day is an acid day, and limestone buildings are dissolving because of it. China has the world's highest number of deaths attributed to air pollution, and lung cancer is now the leading cause of death within the People's Republic. It is estimated that 26% of all deaths in China are caused by respiratory illness, compared with 2 or 3% in the United States. These are all facts that have been discussed widely in China and other countries around the world. Air pollution is a serious worldwide problem because not only does it degrade environment and shorten life expectancy, it is not contained within the polluting country's national borders. However, that is not the subject of this paper. Instead, I will seek to explain what China is doing to combat the problem. In recent years, both China's government as well as the country's private sector have made tremendous efforts in cleaning up the environment. China has invested heavily in green technologies like solar and wind power and has made research and development in green technology one of its top priorities. Historically, China has taken the side of developing countries, which point to larger industrialized nations such as the United States as being top producers of air pollution, without spending too much time, of course, addressing their own emissions. This is now changing, and China is well on its way to becoming a world leader in the area of green technology. China has seen many revolutions in its history, and when they occur, for better or worse, they galvanize the entire population to commit to fighting for what they see as a better future. China is now fighting for a revolution unlike any other, one that will put its economy, its people, and government legitimacy to the ultimate test. Chinese people are all aware that the fact is that no matter what the cost may be, if China wishes to sustain itself within the 21st century, it must go green. Environmental law. To understand this modern revolution in China, we must examine how it originated. Despite the beautiful paintings throughout China's history that depict glorious mountains and rivers, as well as the Buddhist and Taoist emphasis on respecting nature, there is in fact scant evidence in China's environmental history to suggest a unique or exceptional regard for the environment. One example is the Yellow River, where human-induced environmental degradation began at least 3,000 years ago. The expansion of cropland in the southeast corner of the Loess Plateau, the destruction of forests in the south, and overgrazing of grassland in the north brought acceleration of a naturally high rate of erosion. For long stretches, the Yellow River flows above the surrounding croplands, hemmed in by centuries-old levee system that must be continually heightened because of the siltation caused by the river's high solid load. After the communist victory over the ruling nationalists in 1949, the attitude of Mao Zedong was that of conquering nature in an effort to serve the people. Every industrialized society has left its scars upon the environment. However, what set the Mao era apart from other nations was the idea that nature had to be defeated and replaced by utopian idealism, defined as a landscape forcibly harnessed to meet the demands of a modern industrial agricultural state. While the effects of this can easily be seen today, the efforts to tame nature were at the time relatively well intentioned. Mao sought to harness nature to lessen its threats and benefit material progress. He did not actively promote industrial pollution. In 1971, the first governmental entity with an explicit and exclusive focus on environmental matters was established in the State Planning Commission. This was China's Environmental Protection Department. In the succeeding years, China began to take the environmental problem more seriously. In 1972, a contingent of Chinese delegates attended the UN Stockholm Conference on Human Environment. After comparing their country's pollution statistics with those of other countries at the conference, they realized just how serious China's environmental problems were. At the time, China was still waist-deep in its communist philosophy and even applied that to the environment. Premier Zhou Enlai said that being a communist state, China would be able to more easily control environmental pollution because it would serve the masses. Capitalist states, on the other hand, were unable to solve their industrial pollution problems due to their system of private ownership, the anarchism of their production, and their orientation towards profits. China formulated its first set of guiding principles as a result of the conference, and a committee of experts was formed to draft the 10-year program on environmental protection. In 1979, the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress enacted the Environmental Protection Law, which laid out the governmental structure and its responsibilities, requiring all related departments to set up specialized environmental protection and supervision institutes. This was all done in line with the idea that for China to build socialism and realize the four modernizations, goals intended to strengthen the fields of agriculture and industry, national defense, and science and technology, first set forth by Zhou Enlai and later enacted by Deng Xiaoping in 1978, eliminating pollution and protecting the environment was absolutely essential. With each passing decade, the importance of environmental protection became clearer among China's leaders. Just how effective their policies had been, however, was often debated as complaints from scholars and environmental personnel often surfaced. In 1994, China's first environmental NGO, known as Friends of Nature, was formed. 4 years later, the National Environmental Protection Agency, or NEPA, was upgraded to a full ministerial level and renamed the State Environmental Protection Administration. The idea was to allow the organization to turn its proposals into legislation more rapidly. However, its authority stopped just short of cabinet level administrative status. This meant that although SIPA yielded authority within the government, its minister did not have a vote in the state council. The organization, SIPA, was heavily criticized in 2005 when an explosion occurred on November 13th at a petrochemical plant owned by a subsidiary of the China National Petroleum Corporation in Jilin province. The initial reports noted the explosion and resulting loss of life, but did not mention anything about the spill of benzene or the environmental catastrophe the accident was in the process of creating. Local authorities initially swept the truth under the rug and kept the matter a secret. However, when it became necessary to shut off water supplies to 4 million residents in the city of Harbin, the magnitude of the spill could no longer be kept a secret. This created a huge public relations debacle for China and forced the minister of SIPA, Xie Zhenghua, to resign from his post. The incident refocused attention on the weakness in China's environmental regulatory system. Ever since the government began pledging to protect the environment and enacting environmental policies, problems including lack of transparency and corruption have repeatedly surfaced. This has resulted in not only further degradation of the environment, but loss of trust in the government's ability to tackle the problem. In 1989, the Standing Committee of the NPC amended and reissued the country's environmental protection law, but then left untouched until 2014. This left a buffer time of 25 years for polluters to find ways around the system and continue to pollute without any serious repercussions. Without much legal protection from China's highest government bodies, victims of pollution would often turn to crusading lawyers like Wang Canfa, professor at the China University of Political Science and Law. Wang has run the Beijing-based Center for Legal Assistance to Pollution Victims since 1999. In a country where the concept of rule of law is still being formulated, groups like Wang's are essential in maintaining the environmental rights that are being challenged by economic growth. Only 8 years after its formation, the center had logged over 10,000 calls and pursued over 100 cases, some with as many as 1,700 plaintiffs. He has won many of his cases, including one against a paper mill and chemical plant in Shandong province, after illegal discharges led to massive kills at a fish farm. He says the biggest frustrations come when local officials attempt to interfere in the judicial process to protect local industries. Anger over unchecked environmental destruction is one of the main sources of rural unrest in China. While many rural protests take place due to environmental issues, unrest has even found its way to China's economic coastal powerhouses. One that I personally witnessed in October 2012 took place in the port city of Ningbo in Zhejiang province. The Ningbo government had announced plans to build a paraxylene facility at the petrochemical plant in the Zhanhai area near Ningbo. This outraged the local population, and thousands of protesters headed for Ningbo's Tianyi Square, a similar protest that had taken place in 2007 in Xiamen over the same issue, and again in 2011 in the city of Dalian, where over 10,000 people gathered to demand the closure of their PX factory. In 2014, China's government voted to adopt revisions to the country's environmental law that would go into effect on January 1st, 2015. The revised law now had 70 articles, which, while the previous one only had 47, and provided a set of reforms to many of the problems that had existed within the system. The revisions included stricter penalties on businesses and individuals who were found in breach of environmental standards. Businesses would now be named and shamed for breaking environmental protection laws, and individuals in charge of companies found to be in breach of the law would face up to 15 days in prison. The revised law also set no limits on the fines imposed by polluters. Previously, in some cases, the fines had now been so low that it was in fact cheaper to violate environmental limits than install pollution-reducing equipment. In March 2014, Xi Jinping declared a war on pollution, and even though it had taken almost 2 years of debate for China's parliament to pass this law, analysts said it was a positive step in addressing the country's systematic problems with the environment. The revision of this law not only gave implementers a legal framework to challenge polluters, but analysts also said the revision would function as a tool to hold governments and businesses to higher standards. The amendment also included a chapter on information disclosure, which stated that citizens had the right to obtain information about the environment. One of the most hotly contested issues that had been class action lawsuits and who was entitled to file them. However, now more than 300 organizations can sue on behalf of those harmed by pollution. Business and innovation. In the southern city of Changsha in Hunan province, a company for the last several decades has been revolutionizing the way people keep cool in the hot summer months. Zhang Yue is the founder and chairman of Broad Air Conditioning, a company that uses natural gas or diesel instead of electricity to cool office buildings, shopping malls, and factories. The company began using this technology in 1992 when the government was highly incentivizing the use of non-electric chillers to relieve strain on the national electricity grid. The systems, known as absorption chillers, cost much more to install but are less expensive to operate. Absorption chillers are particularly popular in China because many factories already have diesel generators and diesel fuel storage tanks. Air conditioning isn't the only growing sector in China. Windmill technology has taken a huge leap in recent decades. In 1986, China installed its first imported utility-style wind turbine, and by 2001, China had made its very first wind turbine with Chinese-owned intellectual property. In addition to having already become the world's largest national energy consumer, in 2010, China also became the country with the world's greatest wind power capacity. The country had come under a lot of scrutiny as the world's largest CO2 emitter. However, its wind power capacity had also increased 100-fold in just one decade. In 2000, the capacity had gone from 344 megawatts to 44,783 megawatts in 2010. China is now the world's largest wind power market and is beginning to serve as a center for global technological innovation. China's earliest leader in wind power market was Goldwind. Founded in 1998, the company had in 2011 become China's second largest wind turbine manufacturer and the world's third largest. The company benefited from both sustained government support as well as an effective drive for technology acquisition and development. Goldwind Group had also expanded from just the manufacturing of wind turbines to include everything from research and development to financing and construction. Like Broad Air Conditioning, Goldwind has expanded its international presence and now operates offices and facilities throughout Europe, Asia, and the Americas. In fact, Goldwind's rise is reminiscent of the country's economic rise in terms of speed and efficiency. In 2006, the company had already become the world's top 10 global wind energy companies. They rose to number 9 in 2008, number 5 in 2009, and number 4 in 2010, and their sales have approximately doubled every year from 2000 to 2008. The company's revenues have totaled 10.7 billion RMB in 2009, with over 99% of sales taking place in China. Net profit for the first 9 months of 2010 surged 49.7% to 1.53 billion RMB, and its revenue was 10.9 billion RMB during the period, 61.8% more than in the same period of the previous year. In October 2010, Goldwind raised $917 million on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange IPO. China is beginning to serve as a center for global technological innovation. Green innovation from China could play a crucial role in the global transition to a low-carbon economy. In 2012 alone, investors plowed $65 billion into Chinese wind farms, solar panel arrays, and other clean energy projects. According to a report from Pew Charitable Trust and Bloomberg New Energy Finance, this was a 20% increase from the year before. China's total made it the world's top destination for green energy investments in 2012, a position it held in 2009 and 2010 but lost to the United States a year later. Analysts have attributed China's success to its stable, long-term incentives, such as a target goal to get 20% of its energy from renewable resources by 2030. The price tags also haven't hurt the country's chances. From 2010 to 2013, the price of solar panels in China dropped by 75%. All of the clean energy technologies that industry attracted the most investment cash. As Phyllis Catino, director of the Clean Energy Program at Pew, said, when a country has a strong target and a consistent policy, investors will go to invest. In March 2014, around the same time China's Prime Minister Li Keqiang joined Xi Jinping in declaring a war on pollution, Eco Motors, a startup backed by Bill Gates and Khosla Ventures, supported by Vinod Khosla, a California venture capitalist, unveiled its joint venture with a division of China FAW Group, a local car maker. The Chinese partner vowed to spend more than $200 million on a factory in Shanxi province alone, where it would produce more than 100,000 of the new car engines that year. The OPOC two-stroke engines that also will be produced consist of a pair of cylinders, each containing two opposing pistons. The engine's fuel efficiency is said to be 45% better than the four-stroke engines commonly used in today's cars. One of the more interesting aspects of this deal is that it illustrates just how effective partnerships between China and the outside investors can be. The research firm Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimated that the clean technology market in China exceeded $60 billion in 2013, and perhaps the reason for all this success is that many companies are finding China to be one of the best places to start selling their inventive technology. President of Eco Motors, Amit Soman, explained that commercializing new technologies in rich countries can be difficult, since slow growth and legacy assets make incumbent manufacturers reluctant to take a punt on unproven kits. One of the downturns, however, is that companies that move their operations and manufacturing to China will be expected to produce something that will also serve Chinese market if they wish to prosper. China has shown a lot of ambition in areas of air conditioning, wind technology, and the automotive industry, but another impressive area has been its drive for solar technology. In 2007, China set forth an energy plan stating that by 2020, the country would have 1,800 megawatts of installed solar capacity. Only 2 years later, the predictions seem to show that China would exceed that goal by more than fivefold and possibly even tenfold. Wang Zhongying, assistant director at the NDRC's Energy Research Institute, said that China would have the capacity to exceed 10,000 megawatts, perhaps even 20,000 megawatts by the year 2020. At the moment, China is heavily dependent on coal, which is used to generate around 80% of its power. China has been the world's largest manufacturer of solar panels since 2008. The Earth Policy Institute estimates that by the end of 2017, the country will be able to produce 51 gigawatts of photovoltaics by year. To put that in perspective, that is twice the amount as the entire global production of 24 gigawatts in 2010. Several major players dominate the Chinese solar market, including companies like Suntech Power and Yingli Solar. Miao Liansheng, chairman of chief executive officer at Yingli Green Energy, said that his company is going all out to help meet China's clean energy demand. In September 2014, China's national energy consumption had published a new policy in order to help the country achieve an installation target of 13 gigawatts of solar energy in 2014. However, in the first half of the year, the country had only installed 3.3 gigawatts, which meant that there was an immense pressure on companies like Yingli to help China meet its goal. Headquartered in Baoding, China, Yingli Solar is the world's largest photovoltaic module manufacturer in terms of production capacity and shipments. The company was established in 1998, and in 2007 it completed its IPO on the New York Stock Exchange. In 2010, Yingli Green Energy became the first Chinese company and the first renewable energy company to sponsor the FIFA World Cup. Not only does Yingli Green have more than 30 regional subsidiaries and branch offices, but it has distributed more than 10,000 megawatts of PV modules to customers worldwide. In 2014, the company completed a 210 kilowatt solar generator on the rooftop of DuPont China and Research and Development Center in Shanghai. China's National Development and Reform Commission issued a list of encouraged energy resources on June 1, 2011. It placed a high priority on concentrated solar thermal powers, as China is expected to have a 3 gigawatt capacity of CSP by the year 2020. Numerous CSP projects are currently in the works throughout the country. They include the 100 megawatt project in Sichuan Abazhou by Tianwei New Energy, the 100 megawatt project in Ningxia by Beijing Control Technology, and the 2,000 megawatt project in Shanxi by Shandong Penglai Dianli and E Solar. The global fight against climate change, China is certainly making an effort to pull its weight and clean up the environment wherever it can. That said, both China and the United States still have 44% of the world's coal reserves, and the US government predictions say that global coal could increase nearly 50% by 2030. For each out of date power plant shut down in a 2 year cleanup campaign, it added the capacity of roughly two more. Even with all the investment in technologies like solar and wind, China still relies heavily on coal. Another area being explored alongside the research and development of new technologies is how the country might use coal in a different way. For example, China is a leader in the technology of turning coal into gas. It has been using that technology widely to make petrochemicals and fertilizers as a substitute for pricier natural gas. According to Jonathan Wetzel, director at McKinsey & Co.'s China office, the so-called China price, a combination of cheap labor and capital that rewrote the book on manufacturing, has also been spreading to green technology. He says the China price will move into the renewable energy sector, specifically energy technology that relies heavily on capital-intensive projects. Not only is China now able to make things like solar panels a lot more cheaply than Europe or the United States, China has also been more adventurous when it comes to introducing new technologies. Environmental activism. In 2015, standing on a lit up stage in front of a giant projector in front of hundreds of ordinary Chinese, Chai Ying gave a presentation that was shown in its entirety in her documentary Under the Dome. An investigative reporter, Chai Ying, shared with the audience her experience in talking about China's environmental issues with the leaders of the country's environmental protection agencies, as well as those who represent the industries that cover the skies with smog. She began by emotionally describing the birth of her daughter and the tumor she was born with, most likely due to the polluted environment she had been born into. Chai Ying traveled to some of the most polluted cities in China, detailing exactly what was happening to the country's environment. She told of how living in Beijing, she didn't dare take her child outside on some days, and that while on a business trip in Xi'an, she was unable to sleep due to her constant coughing. In her home province of Shanxi, 88.4% of rivers are polluted, and 62% are no longer usable. One man she interviewed pointed to several dead fish in a nearby dried up river and said it resembled a wasteland more than a flowing body of water. She also brought up the issue of PM 2.5 and, using an amusing cartoon, described exactly how the pollutant energy enters through the individual's respiratory system and into the lungs. She showed images of newborn children who had never been outside but were still being diagnosed with pneumonia. The doctors could only give the parents a diagnosis but could not confirm the exact cause of their children's illness, since they lacked sufficient information. The doctors were, however, able to give the parents a startling statistic. In January 2013, 27 cities throughout the country showed exponential increases in emergency department visits. Throughout her lecture, she showed interviews with various representatives and illustrated of one of the major problems facing environmental challenges in China. Even though environmental protection laws are passed, they are rarely, if ever, enforced. For years, many government officials promoted economic growth, which means many of them have close ties to factory owners operating within their district. The environmental agency representatives she spoke with seemed to have a hopeless tone in their voice, and many said they felt unable to do anything about the problem. Another startling revelation came when she found out that Sinopec, China's state-run oil giant, does in fact set the country's oil standards. Lack of representation, lack of authority, and perhaps most importantly, lack of interest is what contributes to the degradation of China's environment. Chai Ying said, even the most powerful government in the world cannot solve this problem. We need to rely on individuals as well. Starting in 1993, Chinese environmentalist, scholar, and writer Ma Jun began reporting on environmental issues for the South China Morning Post. Like Chai Ying, He began his crusade as an investigative journalist with an interest in China's environment and its natural resources. In 1999, he wrote China's Water Crisis. In it, he describes the country's 7 major water basins and the problems which threaten the communities around them. Since 2002, he has been a consultant for the Sinosphere Corporation, advising overseas companies that operate in China on everything from the environment to health and safety regulations. As early as 2005, he was writing articles and exploring the different steps China could take in its environmental revolution, as well as forming an environmental nonprofit organization in 2006. Perhaps Ma Jun and his IPE are best known for is the China Pollution Map Database. It is China's first public database illustrating corporate environmental performance throughout the country. As ordinary people in China become better informed and more concerned about the heavy human and ecological cost of economic development, protests against pollution have increased. In 2012, The Guardian reported on a demonstration that took place in the small coastal town of Qidong, just north of Shanghai. The protest began peacefully, but later heated up and escalated into violent clashes with the police. The locals were protesting plans by a Japanese owned paper mill to build a wastewater pipeline close to a small port. 18-year-old Li Wei told reporters that many people in the area make a living from fishing there, which meant that not only was the environment at risk, but their livelihoods as well. She said, "Protecting the environment is our generation's responsibility. We have a better understanding of these issues." Protests like these take place on a regular basis throughout China, and the government is legitimately concerned. The government's response is usually the typical Wei Wen approach, or policy of maintaining stability at all costs, and taking steps to prevent any protests or escalation of any kind. However, there are instances where that approach fails, and the government is forced to make concessions in order to keep the opposition from getting violent. Examples have included the protest against the PX factories in cities like Ningbo and Dalian, where thousands of ordinary Chinese succeeded in getting their demands met. One of the problems, however, has been the process of coordination. Official requests to hold protests are generally dead on arrival, and the only reason NGOs are tolerated by the government is because they steer clear of confrontational situations. This gives less of an incentive for the government to actually listen to the people, since the repercussions for them might not be that severe. China's environmental activism essentially began in 1994 with the founding of its first environmental NGO, Friends of Nature. Originally, activists were primarily concerned with politically safe issues such as education and biodiversity protection. However, over the past few decades, they have grown to stage protests as well as file lawsuits against corporations. NGOs have been a vital source of legitimacy for this movement, since their methods of going through legal channels, helping victims of pollution, and even sometimes going undercover to expose multinationals that ignore environmental standards have proved very effective. Although the Chinese government has tolerated these organizations, they are still under close scrutiny for any signs of direct criticism aimed at the Communist Party. All registered NGOs still must be sponsored by government agencies and are not allowed to have branch offices in different provinces. Lawyers, scholars, and other activists that operate in and around environmental organizations will continue to be an essential part in China's fight against pollution. But if they are constantly under tight control from the state, their capabilities will ultimately be very limited. Conclusion: China is obviously making an effort to revolutionize its energy industry and protect its environment, but it is simply not because of environmentalism. Geographically, China also has a huge stake in protecting its own environment. In recent decades, environmental trends ranging from deteriorating water quality, water scarcity, air pollution, land degradation, and desertification have increased at alarming rates. If these problems are not faced and fought, China will see environmental effects, including disasters that included extended droughts in the north, extreme weather events, and flooding in the south, glacial melting in the Himalayas, and rising seas among heavily polluted coastlines. It is estimated that about 150 square kilometers of cultivated land in China is lost annually as a result of desertification. From 2005 to 2010, the average increases of CO2 in China was 8%. This means that if air pollution goes unchecked, China will, by the year 2030, produce as much carbon dioxide as the rest of the world combined today. It also wouldn't take all that much to shake the country to its foundations. A 1 meter rise in sea levels along China's eastern seaboard would submerge an area the size of Portugal. The majority of Shanghai, China's largest city, is less than 2 meters above sea level. China's 12 coastal provinces are inhabited by 43% of the country's population and contribute 65% of GDP. The Green Revolution will also require China to rethink its cities. Chinese urbanites use 3.5 to 4 times more energy than their country cousins. By 2011, cities in China were home to 700 million people, double that figure in 1990, more than twice the population of the United States. Those cities also consumed 75% of the energy its power stations generated in 2010. What makes these statistics even more alarming is that by 2035, 70% of China's population is expected to be living in cities. China's energy needs will also continue to plague the country as long as outdated technology is used to meet them. In his book China Fast Forward, author Bill Dotson points out that in the year 2000, China's central leadership was set a goal to quadruple the country's wealth by 2020. That also meant that during the first decade of the 21st century, the country was installing a total electricity capacity of the entire United Kingdom every year. This equated to 3 or 4 500 megawatt coal burning power plants every week. By 2007, China accounted for nearly half of the global cement production, 35% of global steel production, and nearly a third of global aluminum production. As of now, in order to meet China's insatiable and growing appetite for electricity, the country is mostly turning to resources that are relatively inexpensive to mine, plentiful, and readily converted to energy with a minimal amount of refinement. Even though China's leadership is making environmental legislative reforms, much of that effort may have more to do with protecting government legitimacy rather than promoting green activism. Due to increased rural protests throughout China as a result of the environmental degradation, the country's leaders are beginning to face a dilemma. For years, success within the party had went hand in hand with promoting economic development. In the last few decades, however, economic development began to take a heavy toll on the country's skies, rivers, and arable land, usually with the country's most valuable individuals, the young, the old, and the poor, bearing the heaviest cost. For a regime that draws its ideological legitimacy from serving the masses, the emphasis on economic development and its enormous environmental and human cost is beginning to call the leadership's true intentions into question. Another reason why this issue is especially important for China's leadership is because of its relationship with corruption, which has become one of the most heated public discussions in China. And citizens are running out of patience. The environmental protection laws passed in Beijing mean absolutely nothing to the rest of the country if those who are supposed to enforce them have no authority, and the individuals who should be prosecuted simply pay a bribe or find ways around them. Along with going after polluters, China will have to do its best to promote companies like Broad Air Conditioning, Goldwind, and Yingli Solar. They are businesses whose ambition for success seems to be driven as much by environmental conscience as their profit margins. After the newly implemented environmental protection law took effect in 2015 in January, the hope was that allowing organizations to file lawsuits would help victims of pollution as well as clean up the environment. Just how effective that law is will still be questionable. It is unlikely that environmental lawsuits will dramatically improve the quality of China's environment. China may be a strong state-led system accustomed to enforcing policy priorities through bureaucratic targets. However, unlike activist courts in democratic developing countries such as India, China's judicial decisions are far more likely to tinker with standard operating procedures than to suddenly hold the government accountable for policy implementation or expand on sustainable development principles. Realistically, the most effective actors in China's Green Revolution are its people. This includes China's NGOs, its environmental lawyers, and the activists on the ground. The government can, of course, be given credit for the implementation of new laws, but much like big business, the leadership is primarily driven by its own survival, as opposed to protecting the environment and any sort of grassroots activism. Updated environmental legislation is in effect as of 2015, which means that China will now be on a new course of environmental change. However, what will most likely drive the country will be a bottom up revolution with the demands of its population at the forefront. As a result, Chinese businesses will be forced to innovate in order to meet the Chinese people's appeal for change, change which the Chinese leaders will eventually have to legitimize and enforce for the sake of their own survival.